Welcome back after coffee. I think everybody in this room, I'm pretty sure, is very aware of Polly Teale's work. She's a hugely successful award-winning writer and director with great critical and audience acclaim. And she was the artistic director of Shared Experience from 1995 to 2015. Polly takes a forensic look at the real world, but she also makes parts of ourselves visible that are normally hidden. She's fascinated by the contradiction in characters, the contrast between what they reveal and what's going on inside. She describes directing as like excavating something that is 3/4 underground, slowly digging it up and just starting to see what it is. She puts the real world and the interior world on stage at the same time, and she asks the audience the question, what is real? And this makes her the perfect speaker for today. Please join me in welcoming Polly.
Thank you. What a great introduction. I'm going to start by saying that I love working with designers. The way they can expand my thinking about the work. And for me, the designer always feels like the person that I first enter the world of the play with. And I feel a bit like we're two detectives or explorers in a foreign land looking for clues, for anything that can help us to understand this kind of strange new place, this country that we're entering. And I love that process of looking at photographs and images and objects, going on research trips, going to somewhere that kind of brings to life the world in that sort of sensual, visceral way. It's smell, touch, atmosphere, that kind of unexpected detail that can suddenly jump out and surprise you and give a real sense of the depth and texture of life. I was looking at that cart, the Mother Courage cart, and you can almost kind of smell it, can't you? And there's something really so powerful about that sense of kind of lived life. And then that sort of process of mulching together. You've got all this material and stimulus, and you need somehow to distill it into something that can allow the world of the play, with all its specific demands, maybe multiple locations, somehow has to be realised in one entity. But one entity that has the potential to keep kind of flickering and transforming, a bit like a burning fire that can have so many different qualities and keep sort of metamorphosing. It can be dying embers one minute, and then the wind blows and suddenly burst into life in an unexpected way. That's how I kind of feel about sets, that they should have that potential to keep changing and flickering as the play unfolds. So for Shared Experience, I've made several pieces of theatre actually that were based on the lives of real people, and each, rooted in their own very particular time and place in history, in the world. And as I said, I'm always fascinated by all that rich information about the socio-economic, cultural and physical reality of their lives. But what really draws me in is the human story and the complex inner worlds of the characters. So our work at Shared Experience has always been known for its powerful visual and physical life, and a desire to go beyond the surface of our everyday lives and explore that hidden world of emotion, imagination, memory, dreams, all the stuff that's going on inside us the whole time, which perhaps feels more real than this kind of tangible physical world. And so I'm coming back to that question, what is real? And I found a quote from Oscar Wilde in a Shared Experience programme yesterday. As I was digging around thinking of this talk today, And he says our real life is often the life that we do not lead. So perhaps that is also our challenge. How do we begin to find a language to express someone's subjective experience on stage? How do we give form to that other life that we do not lead as well as the one that we do? Because, of course, those are both parts of who we are. I'm going to show you some bits, some excerpts from a couple of my productions, but I'm going to start by talking a bit about working from literature, because adaptation has become an art form in its own right, I think, now, and one which can draw as much on the real life of the author as on the fiction they wrote. So I'm wondering why we're so drawn to novels as a source for theatre. And my suspicion is that when we read a good novel, we feel like we're somehow allowed to kind of enter the skin of the character. It's almost like a chance to know their deepest, darkest fears and longings, to step inside another human being. And maybe that's why we're all so fascinated by plays and films about real people, that kind of hunger to know who they really were that can't quite be answered by a biography. So Shared Experience did several adaptations of great novels, and we were particularly drawn to novels, I think, because of the way they allow us into the inner worlds of the characters, allow us to experience their inner conflicts, their secret desires. And I think it's no accident that all the real lives we brought to the stage were those of writers, and their novels were as great a resource as any biography. So I'm going to talk today mainly about a play that I wrote and directed that was inspired by the Brontes. So hopefully we've got some joint references there. And this kind of love affair began for me when I did an adaptation of Jane Eyre and became completely fascinated by the relationship between Charlotte Bronte's creation, Jane, and the woman that she'd locked away in the attic. So the more I learned about Charlotte from my research, the more it felt like Jane was the outward manifestation of Charlotte, whilst Bertha, that's the name of the mad woman in the attic, embodied the parts of Charlotte that had to be locked away and hidden. The adult Jane is sensible, controlled, rational, whilst the mad woman is the opposite. She's out of control. She's driven by powerful, irrational feelings and forbidden desires. But I'm going to return to this later. And for now, I'm going to read you a few words from Charlotte Bronte's diary. Now, this was written just before she wrote Jane Eyre, and in the months before Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. So just listen to this. I can hardly tell you, this is a letter to her friend Ellen, I can hardly tell you how life gets on here at Howarth. There is not an event whatever to mark its progress. One day resembles another, and all have lifeless physiognomies. Sunday, baking day, and Saturday are the only ones that bear the slightest distinctive mark. Meantime, life wears away. I shall soon be 30, and I have done nothing yet. I feel as if we were all buried here. I long to travel, to work, to live a life of action. So here we're told that the external, or if you like, the real lives of the Bronte sisters could be pretty dreary, uneventful, repetitive. Cooking, washing, cleaning, sewing were a huge part of women's lives at that time. And the research into the period was really invaluable, actually. I'm just remembering some little details. A girl would be expected to be able to sew and make themselves a simple shift dress by the time they were 5. Nearly half of all children born in Howarth would die before their 6th birthday. The library was for men and boys only. So those kind of details just tell us so much about how different their lives were from ours. And as theatre makers, of course, as we've said, we're almost like detectives when we're trying to understand our subjects. And I love that image of Eileen's. She was quoting me saying that we're like archaeologists on a dig, you know. And I feel like that with my designer. We're both sort of digging around, pulling things up out of the earth and saying, look what I found, you know. And certainly in this case, Howarth, the moors and the life of the town and the parsonage were hugely significant, as were the social constraints of the time that meant that the local library was for men only. Women were not expected to read and certainly not to write. So that image from Charlotte's letter of the Bronte sisters being buried alive by the monotony of the daily round of tasks is a really powerful one. And yet their inner lives were very different. As Charlotte wrote those words in a letter to her friends, she and her sisters were about to write some of the most vivid, potent, passionate stories of all time. So kind of what a contrast between the inner life and the reality, if you like, the outward reality. So I began writing the play with a question in mind, which I wanted to try and answer. How was it possible that three Victorian spinsters, and I use that word spinster knowingly because as a woman at that time, not to be married, not to become a mother, was seen as something of a failure. So yes, how was it possible that these three Victorian spinsters who lived alone on the Yorkshire moors and had so little life experience, and as far as we know, no sexual or romantic experience, how could they have written some of the most passionate, even erotic literature of all time? So this was the question I had as I started thinking about what this play was going to be. And how did this place, where Charlotte felt herself to be buried alive, become the kind of petri dish in which these impassioned novels were conceived? How did they get from that reality to the fiction? Perhaps you could argue that it was that very dreariness, that monotony, and their frustration at the lack of opportunity for them that created their hunger for other lives and other worlds, other realities. There was obviously no TV, no internet, no escaping into a good Netflix series, no Skyping or listening to a great podcast to connect you to somebody else of like-mindedness. If you wanted company, you were going to have to create it yourself. So yeah, I wanted to try and we went on a research trip, basically, my designer and I, Angela Davies, and I wanted to try and imagine, you know, what would it have been like back then? And anyone who's ever been to Howarth, I don't know whether any of you have, but you'll know the Brontes lived on the edge of a small town in a remote bit of the Yorkshire moors. This is the very last house on its own, set apart from the rest of the town by the graveyard and the church. So it's really alone up there on the hill. And it's a pretty austere landscape. At that time, there wasn't even a tree. Just the graveyard, the moorland, and the sky. And we walked up onto the moors. It was winter. It was dark by mid-afternoon. And I mean dark, proper dark, the sort of dark we in cities kind of don't really know when actually it's quite hard to see where you're putting your foot in front of you. And I've often tried to imagine what would it have been like when there were no street lamps and only a few candles for light in that vast darkness that must have surrounded them for hours and hours each day throughout the winter. And as we hiked up the hill beyond the town, I tried to imagine how would it have been to cross the moors in long skirts on a rainy, muddy day like this one, as Emily, and in fact all of them so often did. So as I said, I love a good research trip and all that chance to really sort of soak up the real world, if you like. And I love the gathering of photographs, of images with the designer, the reading of letters, biographies, diaries, and the imbibing of the whole world of the story. In the Bronte parsonage, we looked at the actual horsehair settee where Emily died, which was about as unlike a squishy modern sofa as it's possible to imagine. We looked at the backyard where they kept chickens, the dank cold shed, the dining room table where the novels were written. It's all there. The tiny handmade dress Charlotte wore on her wedding day, and her threadbare undergarments, which are sitting in a case in the museum. A sort of disintegrating corset and crinoline, which in themselves tell you so much about what it must have been like to be a woman at that time. So all those details are fascinating and tell us so much about the world they inhabited and the texture of their lives. And yet, this is really only part of their story. And amongst the museum exhibits are a collection of miniature books. They really are tiny, tinier than I was expecting, having seen photos of them. And here, almost invisible to the naked eye, we find their imaginary worlds. Now, these were written as children, and they're worlds of foreign lands, warring kingdoms, magnificent aristocrats, which even as children were as real to the Brontes as the moorlands and the town. Inspired by the exotic real-life travelogues written in the back of their father's newspapers, the stories they wrote as children were to grow into tales of great dynasties that took on a life of their own. And by the time Charlotte was 10, she decided she wanted to be a writer. It was not until later that the sisters discovered that their father had been unusual in educating his daughters and allowing them to read the books he borrowed from the library. That library I've mentioned before, that was for men and boys only. Now here is a letter that Charlotte wrote when she was a teenager to the then poet laureate Robert Southey. And, we don't have the letter she wrote to him. We've got his reply. And she wrote to him to tell him that she wanted to become a writer. And this is what he wrote back, part of his letter. The daydreams in which you indulge are likely to produce a distempered state of mind. Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life and ought not to be. The more she's engaged in her proper duties, the less time she'll have for it, even as a recreation. And we actually have Charlotte's reply. And she said, "Sir, I cannot rest until I've answered your letter. I felt only shame and regret that I had ventured to trouble you. A painful heat rose to my face when I thought of the quires of paper I had covered with what once gave me so much delight, but which was now only a source of confusion. I trust I shall never more feel ambitious to see my name in print." Gosh, what a powerful image you have there, actually, even in her response, that image of the kind of heat of shame and the decision not to write. And we think that for a while she stopped writing. So there we have it, that the sisters faced this very harsh reality. Highly educated, intelligent, full of curiosity and hunger for life, they entered a world where there was little or no place for them. As poor, plain women, their life prospects were severely limited. Becoming a governess to the children of the wealthy was virtually the only profession available. And none of the sisters lasted longer than a few months in this lonely occupation before they returned home. That was the home that was the isolated parsonage where one day resembles another. So between a rock and a hard place. And yet, even as Charlotte wrote these words, the words about how they were buried alive, she was beginning to write Jane Eyre, and then not only one of the most famous eponymous heroines of all time, but also unleash a mad woman, a mythical creature who would come to haunt our collective consciousness. So whilst Jane was sensible, controlled, rational, Bertha, the mad woman, was everything that Charlotte, a Victorian woman, could not be. Jane, like Charlotte, was, in her words, poor, obscure and plain. And yet hidden from view, locked up in the attic of her imagination, was another creature. She comes from a tropical land of hot rain, monsoons and hurricanes, which Charlotte had read about and imagined. In fact, the imaginary world that she and Branwell shared, that they wrote about in these tiny books, was a tropical, it was a very hot tropical landscape. Whilst Emily and Anne, Angria, their kingdom was very cold. So interesting, it all relates to Jane Eyre. So Bertha, the madwoman, she comes from a tropical land of hot rain, of monsoons, of hurricanes, which Charlotte had read about and imagined. And she's both dangerous and exciting. She's passionate and sexual. She's angry and she's violent. The embodiment of everything that Jane and Charlotte can never be. She is perhaps everything that Charlotte both feared in herself and longed to express. So there's something about this collision of drab domesticity and unfettered imagination, of the way they transcended the physical reality of their lives, that has to be captured if we're going to understand their experience and their reality. To tell this story, we had to make visible what was hidden inside these three poor, plain, apparently unremarkable women. And this is why I decided that the house would be haunted, not by ghosts as such, but by the fictional creations of its inhabitants. So while the sisters cook and clean and sew, there exists another world full of passion and fury and infinite possibility. The first time we did Bronte, we actually had huge Bronte-inspired Paula Rego images painted on the walls of the house. So it was a kind of collaboration with Paula. And sadly, there is no existing DVD of that production. I found a great big chunky video tape of it, but useless to us. But I don't know whether you can see a little bit of that. These sort of huge Rego images in the background. Have a look. So I'm going to show you actually the beginning of the second production that we did of it, which began its life at the Watermill. I don't know whether anyone knows the Watermill. It's a tiny theatre. I mean, the stage is really so small. So we had to use the clamped claustrophobic nature of the space. And we decided that the set would be that kind of vast darkness of the sky and the moors. And at the same time, it would be a rehearsal room where objects were picked up off a props table and costumes hung on a rail. A place where we might conjure into being both the real and the imagined. After all, this is a story of make-believe, of the power of the imagination to transcend time and place and circumstance, and to take us to places that we cannot otherwise go. So a rehearsal room feels to me like a great parallel to that. You know, I've always loved the way that as the weeks go on, you see more and more of the world of the play accumulate in the rehearsal room. And the modern world kind of starts to disappear. I mean, if you're doing something a certain period. On the recording, which was made right at the beginning of the Watermill, in fact, I think it was like a public dress rehearsal or something this was shot at. Typically, that's always the time it happens, isn't it? And you can't actually see, but beyond the bit that you can see, there are props tables and there are racks with clothes on. And in the bigger theatres, all of that was on stage. So it was very clear you were in a rehearsal room and that all these kind of, we were kind of conjuring this up from a rehearsal room. And the production began, I'm about to show you the beginning, and the actors were already on stage as the audience arrived, and they were wearing sweatpants and trainers. They had sort of mobile phones, plastic bottles. So we sort of begin in our reality, if you like, 21st century rehearsal room. And as the audience enter, they began to put on rehearsal skirts, bits of costumes, and start to imagine their way into the characters and the world, just as actors do every day in rehearsal. And we had biographies on stage, which they would plunder, pick up at various points, and they even argue at times over disagreements between the biographers as the actors identify themselves with the characters. So, in a sense, in this production, I decided to be completely transparent about the unreality of what we were watching. I wanted to acknowledge that in a way we were just like anyone else who's read the novels, picks up the biographies and tries to imagine their way into the skin of these long dead women. And there is no one truth or reality. There's only our attempt to imagine. And I wanted to use that process of us imagining the Brontes to mirror the process of the Brontes imagining their way into their fictional characters. So just to say, this is 7 or 8 minutes long, so it's quite long, but it will show you the journey from the rehearsal room into both the Brontes' world and then into their imaginary worlds. And at the very end of it, Cathy, as a child from Wuthering Heights, comes running into the kitchen of the parsonage. So we're then entering this sort of fictional world. Yeah, let's go for it. Thank you, Judith.
Was it possible? 3 Victorian spinsters living in isolation on the Yorkshire moors?
It's hard to believe they really dressed like this for walking on the moors, or for carrying in coal, or scrubbing floors.
Or writing books. Here is the painting done by their brother Branwell, now hanging in the National Portrait Gallery. There's a smudge in the middle where he has painted himself out. Well, she looks too fat.
Too miserable. Too pinched.
Not that they were pretty, not at all.
Oh, their lives would have been different if they had been. They would have married.
They would have died in childbirth.
But all had lots of children and never written another word.
Well, perhaps an odd recipe, a letter here or there, but nothing we would know about. They would be gone, lost,
Sunk without trace.
In the deep, dark river that claims us all.
We have no mother. Can none of us remember her? Perhaps that is why our books are peopled by orphans, children abandoned,
Lost.
Alone.
We cannot imagine what it would have been like to have kisses and cuddles, a woman's soft touch, her warmth and her forgiveness.
Well, perhaps that's why we're so uncommonly close, so uneasy with strangers.
Perhaps that is why we have little patience with children, why we are utterly ill-suited to the only job available to us.
Governess.
There are stories about our mother, things we've been told. A bird was once trapped in the house. It flew again and again at the window, broke its wing, its beak, its leg. She kept it and nursed it back to life.
She used to make up tales of foreign lands at bedtime.
Its wing, its beak, its leg. She kept it and nursed it back to life.
No mother. Can't remember. Not a word, not a look, well, not a smile.
We were looking.
Looking.
How so?
She was not there to criticise, to insist on ladylike manners, pretty clothes and gentle speech, to organise tea parties with eligible young men. We were free to read whatever we found, whatever we could get hold of. Milton, Byron, Shelley,
Scott, Homer, Shakespeare, Bronte. Patrick Bronte. Yes, our name printed on the spine in beautiful curling letters.
Our father, born Bronte, an Irish peasant, had himself published at some expense a volume of poems and a book of sermons that sit alongside the rest.
The word, it is this alone that separates us from animals. The power not only to live, but to know you're living. That is to think, to shape ourselves, to make of our lives what we will, to inspire others with what we say, what we believe. Look to God, The great men of history look to art, to literature.
Horace, Bunyan, Johnson,
Thackeray! William Makepeace Thackeray!
Of course it did not occur to us that these books were written by men. Not yet.
we did not know that we too would be remembered. We could never have imagined, never have dreamed.
Or perhaps I could. Perhaps I was always waiting, preparing. The thousands of pages covered with words, the letters, the diaries, the books. Well, who were they for if not? For you. You who know me better than any who ever saw my face.
I am not so interesting to you, or only as a sister. My books will be read as background to their great works.
You are fascinated by me, but I am the hardest to find out about. My book is like a chained door that will only give enough to let you glimpse inside and wonder what it might be like to enter. There are no letters, no diary. My sister Charlotte, after my death, rewrote my poems and burned my second novel. We don't know that for certain. I had been writing all summer. There are letters from my publisher urging me not to hurry the ending. It is not proven. It was written. Emily, do you know what they said about you? Can you imagine what it was like? Our home. The parsonage came with the job. If our father were to lose it, we would be homeless. Well, where would we go?
Who would we be?
We cannot imagine. This place, this house. This is our world.
Our books are covered with flour and splatters of gravy. The library has complained.
Not to us. We are not allowed to go there. Fathers and sons only. But our brother tells us that a carrot peeling was found lying like a bookmark by the librarian. Upstairs, our brother Branwell has his own study. We three girls sleep together, and at the top of the stairs there is a small room, little more than a cupboard, which I have made my own. And that is to say that although there is no lock on the door, we do not go in there. Ever.
Immediately in front of the house lies the graveyard, the church, and then the town. 5,000 inhabitants working mainly in the textile mills in the valley below. Sanitary conditions are poor. Nearly half of all children die before their 6th birthday. The average age of death for a labourer, just 26. Our father was kept very busy.
Some days there are 4, 5 people buried. Among them, our mother and 2 older sisters.
I run my fingers over the letters on the gravestone.
You can hear the sound of the shovels from the house. And Father's voice. He knows the words by heart, as do most of his congregation. Few people can read, even fewer write. Beyond the house is the moor, the blackened heath,
An occasional rock.
a low stone wall that wanders and then peters out. Even the path has nowhere to go, except over the hill and into the sky. You can guess the power of the north wind by the excessive slant of a few gaunt thorns, all stretching their limbs one way, as if craving alms of the sun, as if craving alms of the sun.
So there, that's Kathy has just entered. So we've got the first of the fictional characters coming into the world. And I'm going to just show you in a few seconds of a clip later on where we see We see one of the characters from Angria, Charlotte and Branwell's Imaginary Worlds, and this is really the prototype, I think, for Bertha Mason, who became the madwoman in the attic. And this was Charlotte as a young girl. I think she was about sort of 10 when she started to write this, just sort of coming towards puberty, and she wrote all the way through her teens. This character keeps re-emerging. This is I'll let it explain itself.
The commander watches as she dances and sings. And when he speaks to her, he does so in a low voice, so she must lean close and feel his breath on her ear. He tells her that in all his life he never saw anything so beautiful. And she feels as if her skin is splitting open like a peach that is too ripe. Her heart, like a caged bird, batters her breast so she cannot speak. Let me in! Let me in!
Okay, so we're back. Yeah, so we keep shifting in and out of reality, if you like, in and out of their imagined worlds and the real world. And I'm following a thread here, as you can probably tell, with this woman in the red dress. I'm finally going to show you the beginning of my production of Jane Eyre. I did an adaptation of it where the madwoman was seen as being a part of Jane that had to be locked away. But at the very beginning of the story, and this is quite ancient footage, so it's a bit kind of grainy, the quality's not great, but you'll get some sense that it depicts a scene where Jane, or you could substitute Charlotte, opens a book about exotic foreign lands and starts to read and imagine. And as she starts to imagine, Bertha, her kind of alter ego, creeps out from behind her and starts to entice her into a sort of forbidden game of make-believe. And we see how she's gradually seduced into imagining herself into this forbidden world, much like Charlotte, after receiving Southey's letter and deciding that she'd never write again. Okay.
The vast sweep of the Arctic zone lies buried under frost and snow. These forsaken regions of dreary space are seldom seen by
Okay. So, yeah, you can see these two parts of her that are kind of struggling with one another. And in this next sequence, her cousin, the one in the sort of Donny Osmond hat, continues to taunt her until she finally loses it and she bites him. And the next little bit, we've just got a few more seconds, and you'll see the rest of the set, this kind of charred remains of Thornfield, Rochester's home. So we're going to cut now to the moment after she's bitten her cousin and she gets dragged off up to the Red Room. Okay, we'll stop there. So, yeah, this kind of almighty struggle between the part of herself that's kind of wild and the part that, yeah, that in a sense, she has to put away all of that in order to survive. I'm just going to leave you with a thought. So that the door soon gets slammed on the Red Room and Bertha gets left in there and Jane walks away and goes on with her life. But I'm actually at the moment just finishing a 4-year training as an arts psychotherapist, so I'm going to sort of bring you a little bit of that thinking now. If we want to see houses as a metaphor for the self and for the human condition, I mean, you saw there that it was the kind of charred remains of Thornfield. Well, we could see the grandiose, stately home of Thornfield, that's Rochester's house, representing the kind of patriarchal Victorian system that underpinned the brutality of colonialism. Now, you might remember that Bertha, the madwoman, was the daughter of a West Indian planter, and she was sold off really to Rochester in exchange for an aristocratic title and a kind of respectability. So if we think of the grand house and that kind of facade or false self persona, and that as a kind of emblem, if you like, of power and oppression, and that is finally, at the end of the story, burned to the ground, and this kind of wild, elemental, untamed female part of the psyche or the self is laid bare. The loctatic walls or defences have been destroyed by fire, and the secrecy has somehow been blown apart. So that was our set. The set was as if we were at the end of the story and the fire had happened. And I think, yes, Neil Warmington is the designer of that set. And I think the best sets are really rich with metaphorical and symbolic, even political meaning, as well as a kind of mystery, that we can't probably put into language. So I'm gonna leave you there with that. Thank you.